Well, today is the last Sunday in the summer semester, so we'll be picking things up in the second Sunday of September. But I think we're actually going to be able to finish the book of Leviticus today. I'm not going to promise that, but I think there's a possibility. So let's see if that can happen or not. So this morning we're going to take a look at the last couple chapters of Leviticus, 24 to 27. There's a lot here, so I'm going to pull out a couple of parts. I just want to remind you of something that we looked at last week. Remember, last week we looked at Israel's liturgical calendar in Leviticus 23, and I made the point, right, that the purpose of keeping all the 6 festivals that are listed there was it's to actually organize Israel's perception of time. That is, all the liturgical feasts that Israel celebrates remind her of her relationship with God, the fact that God's the creator, the fact that God's the source of all good gifts, the fact that God is the one who has created and sustained the people of Israel, and that this is sort of works against the natural human inclination to a kind of selfish self-centeredness, right? So, but it also is a way of forming Israel's perception of time. So, really important thing to remember here, right? We have different ways that we can sort of think about time, right? And our normal way, right, is, we look at our calendars and we see time stretching out, and of course we never have enough of it, right? And so we fill that time with all kinds of stuff. The reminder here is that actually all time belongs to God. And all time is the place where God's purposes are worked out. Okay, so here's the way to put this. All of us are going to die with things left undone, right? All of us are going to die with things left undone because our time will have run out. That's not the case with God. By the time that time has been brought to its fulfillment, everything that God desires to happen will have happened. Important thing to remember. I want to read to you, remember we talked about the Feast of Booths, and so this is how chapter 23 ends. It's a description of what's supposed to be done on the Feast of Booths, and I'll let that kind of stand as a summary. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So during the Feast of Booths, during this week, you're supposed to construct a booth, a kind of maybe like a wooden structure with some palm fronds as a roof, and the idea is you have to be able to see the stars at night. And so you're dwelling in this temporary structure, right? So you're doing this for 7 days, and this is to remind you that God brought your ancestors and therefore you through the wilderness after he freed you from Egypt. Okay, so the idea here is Israel is never to forget what God has done for her. And none of what God's done is supposed to be simply regarded as like in the past. Okay? Our equivalent, of course, of this is today is Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Okay? All 3 dimensions of time. Okay, let's take a look at Leviticus 24. It contains a number of things. We don't have time to go through all of it, so I want to kind of focus on a couple things. The first thing I want to focus on is Leviticus 24, verse 5 and following. This is instructions for what's sometimes called the bread of the present. So I'll read it to you and then say a few things about it. You shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf, and you shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile, on a table of pure gold. And we learned about what that table looked like back in the book of Leviticus. Exodus. And you shall put pure frankincense on each pile that may go with the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall arrange it before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever. So here's one of the many things that takes place in the tabernacle. So every Sabbath, Aaron, the high priest, is to go in, and there's a special gold table that sits before the curtain that separates the holy place from the most holy place. And on that table, every Sabbath day, Aaron is to create 2 piles of 6 loaves of bread. Each loaf represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And that bread is said to be a memorial portion. In the book of Leviticus, in the book of Exodus, this is called the bread of the presence. Well, what does that mean? What is the memorial portion? Well, it means something like this. That table of 12 loaves, right, is sitting in the presence of God, right? It's in the tabernacle. And one of its purposes is to, in effect, remind God of his covenant with the people of Israel. Now, there's no thought here, right, that God has like senior moments and sometimes like forgets things and needs to be reminded, oh, do I have a covenant people? Oh, yes, there they are, I'd forgotten. It's not that. It's that actually Israel is able to live with the sense that God has sitting before him a reminder of his relationship to them. Okay, it's one of actually many reminders. The Ark of the Covenant, obviously, as we've seen, right, that's the most explicit reminder because it has the 2 tablets of the covenant actually inside it. Okay, so the idea here is sitting literally in the presence of God, we have this kind of living reminder of God's relationship, God's covenant with the people of Israel. Now, later on in Leviticus 24, we have a regulation that deals with the relationship among people. We saw this back in Leviticus 19. This has to do with killing and violence, an attempt to limit it, still a contemporary problem, right? So here it is. Whoever takes a human life surely will be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor and has it done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury has been given, a person shall give it to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. So notice what's going on here. Now, I think this is sometimes kind of dismissed, right, as being too brutal, but notice what it's doing. This is a world in which, and we still have places where this is the way of life today, right? You know, I do something wrong to the member of somebody's family, and they do it back to my family, and then we do it back to them, and then they do it back to us, and then we do it back to them, and they do it back to us. And as time goes on, right, the response gets more and more violent. You know, you kill one member of my family, I blow up your house. Now that I've blown up your house, you blow up the houses of 4 of my relatives, so I blow up the houses of 6 of yours, and it just spirals, and it goes on and on. What this is designed to do is, this is designed to put a stop to that spiral of violence by saying this. If someone harms you, your retaliation is actually limited to what they've done to you. You can't do any more. Okay? What's happened to you, you can retaliate, but it needs to be limited to what was done to you. So this is an attempt to kind of tamp down that spiral of violence. And notice here, this is significant, right? This applies both to Israelites and also to non-Israelites who are living in Israel. You can't say, oh, well, you know, he's a foreigner. It's all right if everyone killed every member of his family. They don't belong here anyway. No. The same rules apply to Israelites and non-Israelites living in God's land, which is really important. And also notice we also have a provision for dealing with the death of an animal, right? Someone comes and they kill one of my cows, they have to make compensation for it, okay, because they've harmed me. And also, right, they've exerted power over this animal, which we've seen is not to be done. So they have to make compensation for it. And obviously, right, Jesus addresses this later on in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:43, where he actually draws attention to this and then alters it. So in Matthew 5:43, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, you shall love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of my Father in heaven, for he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust." Now notice the purpose here, right? Why is it that you're supposed to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you? Is it so that people will think that you're like a really good person and, oh my gosh, look at so-and-so, he's actually even nice to people who don't like him. Wow, what a great guy. No, that's not it. Jesus says here that God's people are to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them by way of reflecting the character of God, who sometimes seemingly distributes his blessings indiscriminately, right? The sun shines on the just and the unjust. And so Jesus' metaphor here, look, your job is to reflect the character of God. And if you're out there killing all your enemies, that's not going to do it. Okay? There's no witness in that. Okay? I suppose the current example would be, the Christian who, blasts everyone they don't agree with on Facebook. Okay? There's no witness in that. Okay? Really, really important to realize that. Now, I want to spend some time here on Leviticus 25 because outside of Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, this is probably the most important chapter in the book of Leviticus. It deals with two important things that I think we're going to have to kind of work to understand. The first thing is the Sabbatical Year, and by this we're not talking about college professors going to Paris to study. It's something else, and the Year of Jubilee. So let's take a look at those two things. The Sabbatical Year is described in Leviticus 25, 1 through 7. I'll read it to you and then say a couple things about it. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." The land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. "For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of its. You shall reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of the undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land." So every 7th year, the land gets a Sabbath. Every 7th year, nothing is to be planted or grown, allowing the land to have a Sabbath and therefore to rest. Now, what's going on here? Well, I think it's sort of underlines a really important principle that we've seen before, and maybe the best way to see it is to flip back to Leviticus 18:24. The principle at work here, right, is, once again, the land belongs to God, and the land is not just given to people to use however they want. Just like time is not given to people to use however they want, right? The keeping of the Sabbath is not optional, okay? You can't say, I don't think I'm going to keep the Sabbath this week. I'm just too darn busy. No, you have to keep the Sabbath, right? God is going to force you to rest. How about that? Okay, here's another comment about the land that I think helps us understand it. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of the things or by these things of the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. And the land has become unclean, so that I punish its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of the abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean. Lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nations before you. That's pretty strong language, right? Notice what's the analogy here, right? Is if you swallow something, right, and it goes into your stomach and that thing shouldn't be there, your body has a way of protecting itself, right? Your body says, you know what? This doesn't belong here. I'm going to get rid of it. And up it comes. And that's the same principle here, right? Notice here, the land is not simply thought of as like an inert piece of real estate. If Israel contaminates the land, if she lives in an unholy way, the land will realize the land is being polluted, and the people of Israel will be vomited out, removed from the land. So, very important idea about the land, right? There's a kind of like a theology of the land that's at work here, and it shows up here in the Sabbath. So the land's allowed to rest because the land doesn't simply exist for our purposes. It has a meaning beyond us because it ultimately belongs to God. Now, I'm going to say the second part of Leviticus 25 is devoted to the Year of Jubilee. So let me once again read part of it to you, and then I'll say a few things about it. This is probably one of the most unusual and interesting pieces of the book of Leviticus. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of 7 weeks of years shall give you 45 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes of undressed vines, for it is a jubilee. It is holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. And so let me say just a brief word about what's going on here with the Year of Jubilee. So you may remember, right, and we'll see this again when we get to the book of Numbers. The land of Israel is parceled out to all the 12 tribes, right? So God assigns certain portions of the land to the 12 tribes, with the exception, of course, of the tribe of Aaron, who gets no land and therefore is supported by the people. Now, as time goes on, right, as we all know, right, there are going to be sort of like economic disasters. So here's what often happened in the ancient world. Let's say you're a small farmer. You've got your like 5-acre plot over here, right? And one year, there's a drought and your crop's wiped out. What are you going to do? That crop was going to provide your income for that year. And of course, right, in these days, there's no Department of Agriculture that's going to come along and maybe, give you like an emergency loan. What's going to happen to you? Well, probably what's going to happen to you is you're going to have to sell your land. And you'll become a sharecropper, probably on your own land. This is sort of like the whole scenario of the whole ancient Near East. What happened over time was, right, people, small farmers, were forced off their land into poverty, and the land, more and more of the land was owned by fewer and fewer people. This, of course, in a culture which is pre-industrial. So remember, in this culture, land is money. There's no stock market, no corporations making stuff, right? Land is money. If you don't have land, you have no money. So that's what happened throughout the ancient world. The Year of Jubilee is designed to prevent that from happening. So every 50th year, here's what happens. Every 50th year, all land reverts back to its original owner. So, right, Joe sharecropper, right, there was a drought. Joe had to sell his family farm. He's now a sharecropper. Every 50 years, right, the land actually goes back to his family without cost. Now, why does all this happen? Well, God gives the reason in Leviticus 25:23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in the country you possess, you shall allow redemption of the land. Notice what's going on here. The Year of Jubilee is designed to prevent from happening in Israel what happened in every other place in the ancient Near East. That is, it's designed to prevent a kind of system where more and more land ends up in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and you have a small group of people over here who are fantastically wealthy, and a large group of people here who are basically living at a subsistence level, right? They basically know where their next meal's coming, and that's about it. God says, this is not to happen among you. So here's what we're going to do to prevent that from happening. Every 50 years, all land that's sold reverts back to its original owners, and it gets even better. All debts are forgiven. Right? So, the credit card companies don't like the Year of Jubilee, right? Now, we just want to kind of take a step back and I think try to understand what's going on here. Obviously, it can be misunderstood, so I think it's important to put this in the right context. I think what you can do, and this is kind of my way of explaining it, and if it's helpful, good. If it's not, then you can forget it. There's a realization here, right, that there are two forms of paganism in the world. There's religious paganism, right, where you have all kinds of gods and goddesses, and you trade gods and goddesses like you trade baseball cards or whatnot. And then there's also what you might call economic paganism. Okay? Economic paganism is really easy to understand. Its motto is something like this: to hell with the poor. That's the motto of economic paganism. God's telling his people, look, you are neither going to practice religious paganism nor economic paganism because you are my people. I do not want you to come to look like Egypt. This is not going to happen among you. Right? Because, right, if you live like everyone else, right, if you've got all kinds of gods and goddesses and economic paganism and all this stuff is going on, right, how are you identifiable as belonging to me? So that's what's going on here in the Year of Jubilee. It's a recognition that the people of Israel need to stand out and also be different from other people. Now here's another passage from Leviticus 25. It's Leviticus 25:35, and I think it contains an important lesson. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear the Lord, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him money at interest, nor give him food for profit. So, two other things here that the people of Israel are not allowed to do. Thing number one, if you lend a fellow Israelite money, you may not charge interest. Thing number two, if you're in sort of like a food crisis, right, and you end up having to supply food to someone, right, you're not allowed to do that to make a profit. But in effect, right, you're in the middle of a food crisis, you're not allowed to take advantage of the food crisis and gouge a fellow Israelite by saying, okay, here's 5 loaves of bread. Normally they'd be, $3 a piece. I'm going to charge you 15 because this is a crisis. Can't do it. Now, once again, I think it's important to sort of understand the fundamental principle that's guiding all this stuff, right? It's the idea that the land belongs to God, and the land's been given to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the people of Israel to make sure that that happens. Okay? This is not a legislation that's going to demand, right, that everyone sort of like, have equal amounts of everything. But rather, it's legislation which demands a sense of responsibility for your fellow Israelites. And also a recognition, right, that whatever you have came from the land that God gave you and therefore isn't simply yours. You are a steward of whatever it is that you have. Now, Joseph, if you were here at 9 o'clock, talked about consumer culture. I think this is like the fundamental difference between a consumer culture and the culture that Scripture is trying to build, right? In a consumer culture, right, we're taught, this is our consumer catechism, right? In a consumer culture, we're taught, okay, your happiness consists in getting more and more stuff, okay? And so, here's how it works. You're sitting in your living room one day, flipping through channels, right, and you happen to land on the Home and Garden Network, which don't ever do, because that's deadly. And and you just happen to land in the middle of some show, right, where some wonderful couple is like renovating their kitchen, right, for the 3rd time that year, right? And all of a sudden, right, you're reminded, wait a minute, when was the last time you renovated your kitchen, right? What? You haven't renovated your kitchen in 4 years? Good heavens, what's wrong with you? That sort of thing, right? And the other thing that distinguishes a consumer culture from the culture that Scripture is trying to create, right, is in a consumer culture we're taught, right, that everything we have simply belongs to us, and it's totally our business what we do with it, right? The purpose of money is to finance a lifestyle. That's the message. The culture that Scripture is trying to build is very different. It's saying, right, look, you are a steward of whatever it is that you have. The question you'll always have to ask yourself, right, about how you use your talents, your time, your money, or whatever it is, right, how am I using what I have to serve God and serve other people? That's the question, right? So for us, for example, right, work isn't just simply a matter of work. Work's a matter of vocation, right? How can I serve God? How can I serve other people? That's what Leviticus 25 is kind of predicated on. One final thing about Leviticus 25 I think that's important, and this text was obviously overlooked in all kinds of discussions about slavery, but in Leviticus 25:46, we're told rather explicitly that you may not make a fellow Israelite into a slave. You may not make a fellow Israelite into a slave. So once again, we have God doing this. We have God kind of putting sort of dampers on some fundamental human practices, right? The practice of taking advantage of other people, the practice of enslaving people, the practice of escalating cycles of violence. God's working actually to suppress all those kind of ideas and tendencies. Now, one final thing. In 26, we have a series of blessings that are pronounced. And I think maybe one way to sort of think of this, or one way to kind of get a handle on what's going on in Leviticus 26. And by the way, in the ancient world, all covenants came or were concluded with a series of blessings and a series of curses. Okay, so if you keep this covenant, here are the blessings that are coming. If you break the covenant, here's the punishments that's going to come upon you. Okay, so in the first part of Leviticus 26, we get an enumeration of the blessings of the covenant, and they're all summed up like this in Leviticus 26:11. This is sort of like the blessing if the people of Israel keep the covenant. Here it is. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you, and I will walk among you, and will be your God, and you shall be my people. That is, the ultimate blessing of covenant faithfulness for the people of Israel is that God is actually going to make his dwelling among them. He will walk amongst them, and they will be his people. That's the ultimate blessing of the covenant, right? The blessing of the covenant isn't that, you get some really good stuff or something like that, right? No, the ultimate blessing of the covenant is that what you get is nothing less than the presence of God. Okay? So the thing that we want to kind of think about this as we conclude the book of Leviticus is this. It's really important to kind of have a sense of what all this is aiming toward. That is, sometimes I think, we read the Bible and we sometimes miss the forest for the trees. There's all this stuff that's said and we kind of get lost in it. But here in Leviticus 26:11, we're being allowed to see the forest. That is, what is all this aimed toward? Well, it's actually quite simple. What all this is aimed toward is to change and purify sinful human beings so that God may literally dwell among them just as he did in the Garden of Eden. So remember, I've tried to make the point, right, that the tabernacle is the one place in the world that's been restored to the status of Eden, right? God's intention is that that's actually going to be true for the whole world. Okay, so this is not just God like doing kind of little stuff. Rather, the big project here is nothing less than taking people who are turned away from God, who are kind of immersed in sin, idolatry, and all kinds of other things, to take them, to refashion them, and to fit them now so that God can actually dwell and live among them. Because, as God makes clear here, right, the ultimate blessing of the covenant, capital B, is God himself. That's the blessing. And that's what's being promised here as the book of Leviticus comes to its conclusion. When we come back on the second Sunday of September, we will begin the book of Numbers. It's the final book in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And in the book of Numbers, we're going to spend some more time at Mount Sinai, and then we're going to begin the journey to the Promised Land. And one of the things we'll discover is the journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. Well, I'll put it this way. It was not fun. More about that later.